Hello again. This is In Conservation with. My name is David Lindo. In Conservation, for those who are new to it, is a series of Zoom interviews in which I chat with some of the movers and shakers within the world of conservation. And some of these people might be scientists, they might be writers, they might be lay people. It doesn't matter who and how they're connected to the world. It's just that they have an element of stuff to talk about. And I'm really, as ever, happy to have guests, but I'm particularly happy to have my good friend Stephen Menzie, whom I have known. I've known you since you were a boy, I think. I mean, you're
hmm
still a boy
hmm
now.
Yeah.
Um, how are you and where are you, sir?
Hello, David. I am very, very good, thank you. I am at home in southern Sweden at the moment. So I used to tell people, you'll tell from the accent I'm not Swedish, but more and more people are telling me I'm picking up a Swedish accent. But originally from Liverpool, lived in the UK for the first 30 or so years of my life, and then moved out to Sweden. And I've been out here for about 3.5 years now.
You are a man that I actually have known for some time, but never knew that much about. Because I first, for your information, everyone, Zoomers, and also people in the future watching this on YouTube. And by the way, if you are watching this on YouTube, please tell your friends, like and subscribe, leave a message, and all that sort of stuff. Because the more people to get to know about all this stuff, it'd be great. When I first met you, I you used to work for Bird Guides,
Mhm.
the actual the app, and that became something else, Nature Guides or something.
Nature guides. Yeah.
And you were the guy I used to come in and sort of do work with your bosses, basically. But you were the guy who helped me with tech. I mean, this man, by the way, Stephen, forget about his birding prowess. He is one of those people that if you had to marry someone, you'd marry someone like him who can do all your tech stuff, and you marry someone else that can do all the handiwork and the plugs and all that sort of stuff. He is absolutely. I mean, you really helped me out majorly with some of the computer issues I had, and I want to thank you publicly and for all time, be on record for helping me as much as you did, because you just offered yourself up in terms of, oh, give me a call or whatever time, call me and I'll help you out. So I want to thank you for all the help you've given me
Well,
in the past.
you're welcome for that, and I hope we don't come across her this evening if your internet is struggling at some point. I'll nip over and I'll sort that out for you as well.
You've become quite a prominent feature within the birding world, particularly in the UK. I never even realised how much of a you kept it kind of under your sort of bonnet in a way, in terms of how much you knew and all the stuff you kind of got involved with. But tell me about your history in terms of when you first gazed up and looked at a bird. What happened? What did you have a spark moment, as our American friends say?
I mean, this is that classic "I've been a birder all my life" thing, isn't it? And at what point do you define when I became a birder? But according to my parents, by the time my sister was born, so she's 2 years younger than me, by the time she was born, I was taking myself to the patio window at the back of the house, and I was sitting and watching birds in the garden, which was perfect for my parents because it was sort of free childcare. They noticed this. They are not birders themselves, but they saw my interest, and they set up a feeder out in the back garden. And sort of sometime after that, depending who you speak to and how liberal they're being with the truth, I could tell male and female house sparrows from each other, and blue tits and great tits from each other. And my parents and grandparents sort of knew enough that they were able to teach me some of these basics. But it wasn't until I was about 7 years old, I guess, 6 or 7 years old, that the Liverpool Park Ranger Service were running walks and talks around the parks in Liverpool. And my grandparents and my mum used to take me on those, and that sort of really pushed my birding. There was never a spark moment as such, but I remember very, very distinctly on one of those walks being shown my first chiff chaff singing down on Otters Pool Promenade in Liverpool, and hearing that and not knowing what it was and being told what it was, and then sort of spending time looking for it. That sticks in my mind really, really distinctly. And then by the time I was about 12 years old, I had joined the local Liverpool RSPB group, and really I was taken under the wing of the leader, Chris Tynan, who was fantastic, was effectively a sort of father figure for me as I was sort of getting into birding as well. Would take me.
Can you still hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. So Stephen's gone.
Looks like he's gone.
Oh, that's a shame. I thought it was my problem. So Fran's saying that Stephen's gone. Okay. Well, let's hope.
I'm
He's
here.
back.
I can see you guys.
Okay, you're back. You're back. Just
Yeah.
about to start panicking.
Is what were we saying about internet connection?
Exactly. I thought it was me, but it's obviously you.
Yeah, I think that was me at my end.
Yeah,
Where did we get to? Local RSPB group.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so saying Chris Tynan, the leader of the group, and the rest of the group, were so hugely welcoming to me, and that really sort of progressed things in my, I guess, birding career. Were we went further afield. We went down the North Wales coast and saw black-throated divers and Slavonian grebes, and all of these birds that up until that point I knew from the field guides, but sort of had never thought that I would actually see them. And then from there, I guess the rest is history. They sort of got me into leading walks for them, discovering different birds you could see in different habitats at different times of year. Really sort of set the groundwork for everything else that I've done in my life since. So there was never one defining moment. But there was sort of, over the first 12, 15 years of my life, there was that sort of quite steep learning curve up.
That's brilliant. I feel very, I don't know why, but I mean I know why, but I feel very proud of you in terms of how you kind of progressed. I mean, you are now the editor of the prestigious magazine British Birds. You're a member of the British Birds Rarity Committee. I mean, that's no mean feat. You're a tour leader for Wings, and between March 2020 and April 2023, you were the manager at Falsterbo Bird Observatory in Sweden. Amazing. I mean, the sort of progression is what a lot of birders who are really serious would kind of dream about, really. You really obviously. I mean, I think of you now as someone that's really all over it when it comes to identifying birds, in particular, looking at molts and stuff like that, which is for me, as much as I've been birding all my life, and I know many people have the same issue. I can't. Sometimes I look at a wader and I still don't realize it's a juvenile because I'm not looking at it in those kind of with those kind of eyes. But this kind of interesting detail, because for me that is detail, talking about goals and P1s and P whatever, the primary numbers, that is a detail. And that is something that scares a lot of birders and scares a lot of non-birders as well, because they feel they need to know that detail. Firstly, when did that detail enter your life? Was it from day one when you were sort of distinguishing male from female in house sparrow? Or was it something that you kind of consciously decided to concentrate on?
I think it was. I think the very fact that I wanted to know the difference or learned that difference between male and female house sparrow, but that sort of, that's the same basis that I approach everything with now. Many birders are happy with seeing a bird and identifying it. And my sort of point is always, okay, you've identified it. What about subspecies? Can we identify it to subspecies? And that may help with, for example, geographical origin or something like that. Can we say if it's male or female? And this is fairly straightforward. If you have something like a blackbird, for example, very, very easy to tell the sexes apart. But what about something like a redpoll, for example? That gets a little trickier, because then you start throwing age into the mix. So what age is this bird? And those were the questions that I would always ask. And it would always be things like, is it the same robin that's coming back to our garden year on year? Once you learn to age robins, which are fairly straightforward to age, looking at them in the field, you start to realize that every year it's a young bird. Every bird, it's a year that hatched that year that is coming, quote, back to your garden. So for me, that interest was always there. And I remember reading as a kid in the RSPB magazine, there was an illustration of some blue tits, some sort of garden feeder birds. And there was this little caption that said something like, young birds have a little bit of green on the wing, or something like that. It wasn't in any great detail. It was just a sort of passing comment. And that sort of, that caught my imagination, because suddenly it sort of opened this world of being able to age these birds in the field. If you knew what to look for, clearly it was possible to work out, just as it is with species or subspecies or sex, also to work out the age. And that really has just sort of amplified. I always describe myself, when people ask, as a birder, even though I spend a lot of my time ringing, a lot of my time at Falsterbo. I'm handling birds and looking at birds in the hand. But most of the time I'm looking for features that I can then apply to using in the field. And for me, the greatest enjoyment I get from watching birds is an interest. I find birds interesting, and that sort of makes me tick. That's what keeps me going out looking at birds every day. And so it's almost sort of added value if you can add extra interest to every sighting you see, even if that's, we'll see. I've got some slides for later. One of them is a feral pigeon. And people sort of sigh when I show them a feral pigeon. Feral pigeons are really interesting. When you start to look at the molt and the aging of feral pigeons, they're one of the hardest birds to age correctly, because they have a really complicated molt. And I find that fascinating. If I'm sat at the bus stop and I look down at my feet and I see a feral pigeon walking around, there's something interesting to look at with them. And I think most birders will sort of dismiss feral pigeons. So that's always the approach that I'm taking, is how much can I get from that bird? What interest can I find in that bird?
It's really fascinating, because you've made me think about how I look at birds, and I've always been interested, I suppose, in behavior. And I remember when I was young, when I was about 18, I was lucky enough to be mentored by the great Peter Grant. For those who don't know, he was the father of the Collins Guide, one of the fathers of the Collins Guide. Unfortunately, he died in 1990, but he put me under his wing for a couple of years. And whenever I went birding and I met him, excuse me, he would tell me stuff that no one else was saying. Like, for example, he was the first person to tell me that chiffchaffs are always bouncing their tails compared to willow warblers. And I guess I began to start looking at birds and trying to see different ones. So looking for the unusual amongst the usual. And in Extremadura, in Spain, where I am now, I think I've got a bit of a reputation now for finding small versions of things. Like I found the other day a dunlin, but it was like a third smaller than the other dunlins. And I was thinking, what is that? I don't know what it is. And I took pictures of it. I circulated it to a few of the friends around here, but in the end I had to go to the great God, Killian Milani, to ask him. And he came back immediately and said, look, could be one of those Arctic races, And it's interesting when you start looking at these things, even blackbirds, and you notice the ones with the black beaks, and you kind of think, does that come from Norway? Or, because it seems kind of skittish. That's how I look at things. But then when it comes to the molt, and when it comes to sometimes sexing, I start falling down. So I'm hoping that in the next few minutes, when you start showing us some stuff, maybe, just maybe, even at this stage of my life, I might come and turn a new corner. So I'm looking to you,
The
Steve.
u- the usual response is you'll leave your head spinning a little bit, and then it will settle down a little bit, and then you'll start to make sense of it. Really it's the same as when you approach identification. You don't dive straight into identifying a Caspian gull or a Hughlings gull or whatever until you've got the basics of herring gull variation sorted.
So it looks like you're frozen again, Stephen. Can someone confirm that? And it's not me. I can't see anyone, by the way, so you have to tell me. Oh, maybe it's me.
Clee.
I think I'm back.
Yeah, you're back. We can see you. So with molten aging, it's that same sort of process. It's the learning to walk before you run with it, and it's working out the basics. It's that same sort of thing as well. Of to go back to the gulls. If you told me that you'd seen a Hugling's gull, but you couldn't find P10 on the bird, it's unlikely that you found a Hugling's gull. So the same applies to molt. By understanding the molt strategies, by understanding the sort of sequence of molt and so on, then you can start to use that as a tool to apply it to different species and different birds. Understanding the basics really unlocks a lot of the function of it.
Okay, well, let's have a look at your slides and let's see if we can make some sense of this. Because
yeah, super. I'll run through and we
yeah,
can chat through them while we're
yeah.
going.
For those live, don't forget that you can watch this if you put it on speaker view. You get a much better view of what's going on. Yeah.
Right. So hopefully you can see that.
Yes.
Right. So I mean, this is a little bit of background, really, and it won't come as any surprise from what I've been telling you. This is what my photo collection looks like on my computer. This is from when I was ringing out in Spain, and these are all Chetty's warblers. So all Chetty's warbler wings and tails and profile shots, and Chetty's warbler from just about every angle. Some people say I'm obsessed. I like to say that I am thorough. What I'm looking for is clues for how we can age these birds and the molt of these birds. At this point, you don't really need to know exactly what that arrow is pointing to, but that's pointing to a clue that allows us to say how old this bird is. And that's all very well and good, but often you don't see the bird like that. You more often see it like this in a sort of field scenario. So what I've always been interested in is taking those clues and taking those features that we can use in the hand, sort of as a ringer, and then transferring those across to what we can use in the field as a birder. I have to sort of preface this by saying this is, of course, in ideal conditions. I mean, Chetty's warbler are quite difficult to age, even if you have them in the hand. They are tough if you have one sat like we've got here on the right-hand side, but normally this is the sort of view that you get. That's a really, really important takeaway with molt and aging in general is don't push it. Don't try and age a bird where you can't see it well enough. Even birds where you can see it well enough, sometimes you simply have to leave the bird unaged. It's often difficult unless you've got perfect lighting conditions, perfect views, great photographs. But everything I'm going to talk about from here on in is assuming that we have good views of the bird. So I'll just run through quickly a bit of topography. Let's get that up. So we've got the greater coverts. The greater coverts are quite important when it comes to molt. There's often quite a lot going on in the greater coverts. Same with the tertials. The primaries as well are important when birds are undergoing a complete molt, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and the same with the secondaries. So really with these 4 feather tracts, we can get by with most of the molt that we're going to be able to look at in the field. This is what it looks like when the bird is in a natural perched position. So greater coverts are still visible, tertials, secondaries, and primaries are also visible. This, by the way, is a red flank blue tail, and I just dropped that in because why not? This was the second one that I'd ringed here at Falsterbo. Okay, so what is molt? It sounds a fairly obvious question to begin with. Most people know that molt is the loss of feathers. And, you know, we kind of think that stereotypical view of molt of feathers flying around here, there, and everywhere. But it's not really just the loss of feathers, and it's certainly not the chaotic loss of feathers. It's not this. This is a bird that is suffering from mites or lice or whatever. This is a common minor. It's lost most of the feathers on its head. This is not molt. This bird has a problem, but it's not molt. This is a blackcap that's suffering from a fault bar. A fault bar is when the feathers were grown and the bird went through a stressful period, maybe a lack of nutrients or some other stress, and you end up with a weakness in the feather, and the feather eventually breaks. This is an extreme case. This bird actually was at Falsterbo. It was trying to migrate, and it was effectively hopping south, such is the drive to migrate. But certainly, this bird wasn't going to cross the ocean. But this is not molt, and similarly, any sort of damaged feathers are not molt. This bird certainly needs to molt, but this is not molt. And equally, these sort of plumage aberrations, you can see here's this is a hybrid hooded carrion crow by chance, but you quite often see carrion crows with these sort of white bands in the wing and so on. That's not molt either. That's plumage aberration or extreme fault bars. Molt is the controlled and ordered loss and regrowth of feathers, and all of the words in that sentence are all quite important. It's controlled, and it's controlled in such a way that it happens in a particular order. We can predict that order, and that's what allows us to use molt to age birds. And obviously, it's not just the loss of feathers. If every time a bird molted, it lost feathers, then we'd end up with oven-ready chickens running around. It also includes the regrowth of feathers. Because it's controlled and because it's ordered, it's symmetrical. And that's quite important when it comes to looking at molt in the field. And as I said, it's predictable. So therefore, we can use this sort of ordered symmetrical pattern to predict what a bird should have molted and what it will have molted given if it's a certain age. Just to sort of hammer that point home, here's a common gull. Many birders would look at this and say it's molting the feathers in its right wing. But if we take a look at the left wing there, you see it's completely normal, completely undamaged. This is just feather damage. If it was molt, first of all, it'd be very unusual. As I said, predictable and not expected in a young common gull like this. But if it was molt, we'd see it on both wings because it would be symmetrical. So why do birds molt? Once a feather is grown, it's dead. And with a few exceptions, the bird can't change the appearance of the feather and it can't repair the feather. So if a bird wants to substantially change or repair or replace the feather, it has to grow a new one. So you can see here this ring-billed gull. If you look at the primaries and the tertials, they're worn down to the feather shaft in some cases. They're really, really worn. A lot of this comes about through bleaching from the sun, and also kind of mechanical and biological bleaching. And by that, I mean grit and sand and also bacteria and small mites and things that get in the feathers. So birds need to molt to renew their feathers. If they don't have feathers, then they can't thermoregulate, they can't fly, they don't look like a bird. Your plumage is important for display and things like that. Because birds can't change feathers once they've grown them, if birds want to substantially change their appearance, by and large, they have to molt. And so that goes for birds that are going from a juvenile plumage, like this blackbird, to an adult plumage. They reach that plumage by molting. And the same happens for birds that have a substantially different winter and summer plumage. So in this case, here's a pied flycatcher. To get from that brown winter plumage to that black and white summer plumage in the males, they have to molt. So if a bird is regrowing some or all of its feathers, that requires a lot of energy. A lot of nutrients and so on goes into creating those feathers. And it also takes time. A bird cannot simply drop all of its feathers all at once and then regrow them all at once. If it did, it would freeze, or it wouldn't be able to fly, and it'd be predated, or wouldn't be able to feed. So they have to change their feathers bit by bit. They have to fit molting in around the two other big aspects of their life. One of those is breeding, and one of those is either migration for birds that migrate, or surviving the winter for birds that don't. And if you think about it, if you need nutrients and you need time, you don't really have time when you're breeding because you're constantly having to feed young and look after them. You don't have nutrients through the winter. If you're trying to survive the winter and get through the day, you don't also want to be growing feathers. And if you're migrating, you don't have time to feed as well, but also you want your plumage to be in tip-top condition. You don't want to have gaps in your wing that would slow you down and things like that. So that means that within a bird's annual cycle, molting is fitted in around these other activities. And again, that helps to make it quite predictable. That means that species have a defined time of year at which they're molting. So if we go back to the title slide, this is a starling. And you can see that these, the browner primaries, the outer primaries, and all of the secondaries, they're the old feathers, in this case, juvenile feathers, but old feathers is all we need to know about here. And then those sort of inner 4 1/4 primaries and the corresponding primary coverts and the greater coverts, they're new feathers that are molting through. And you can see just about the middle of the primaries there, and you can see there's just that 1/4 of a feather starting to poke through. That feather is actively growing. At this point, that feather is still alive. It still has a blood flow. And that's going to grow to full length. And the next feather is going to drop. So this is active molt. And when most of us think of molt, we're thinking of this. We're thinking of this sort of actively growing of feathers like this. Here's a herring gull. And not by coincidence, you'll notice that if we put them side by side, pretty much the same. The herring gull is a couple of feathers ahead of the starling, but you can see the inner primaries are grown, the corresponding primary coverts are grown, the greater coverts are grown, but the secondaries are still old, the outer primaries are still old, the sort of leading coverts on the wing are still old. And as I said, the molt has a defined sequence and a defined order. So it's not surprising that these two species, despite being quite distantly related, have a similar sequence of molt. And as I hinted at, that molt will progress this way on the primaries out, and then the secondaries will start and it will progress this way inwards. And that happens in most birds, similar sequence. So at least the primaries happens in that same way. So this, as I said, we define as active molt. It happens for a short period of time. It fits in that triangle that we looked at before between migration and breeding. And birds are only actively molting for the duration of time it takes them to renew the amount of plumage that they need to renew. However, for most of the rest of the year, what we're seeing is the effects of that molt. And actually, that's the thing that really interests me. There's a lot happening with this active molt. There are some really great books written on the subject, Biology of Molt by Jenny and Winkler, for example. There's a fantastic book to read that details all of the biological processes and everything that's happening there. But for myself as a birder in the field, what I'm mostly interested in is the longer lasting effects of molt. There are two types of molt, broadly speaking. There's complete molt and there's partial molt. I put some little stars around the important points to take away from this short talk. Complete molt, as the name suggests, is all of the feathers. It's complete: the head, the body, the wings, the tail. It is more often undertaken by adult birds. As with everything in this talk, there are exceptions, but it's most often undertaken by adult birds, often after they've bred. Partial molt, on the other hand, is, again, as the name implies, partial, but it's extremely variable. And it can vary from just a few feathers to almost all of the feathers, but generally it doesn't include the flight feathers. It's often undertaken by young birds shortly after they've left the nest. And it's usually how birds that have a dramatic change from non-breeding plumage into breeding plumage, it's normally how that breeding plumage is acquired. So a couple of examples here of what would be considered a partial molt. What I've done, I've put red feathers are old feathers, blue feathers are new feathers. In this case, this is just an extremely limited partial molt. This is a more typical partial molt, where the body or just some of the wing feathers, some of the greater coverts, some of the tertials are molted, and then the more extreme partial molts that also includes primaries and secondaries. If a bird has a partial molt, then just by the very mechanism of changing some feathers and not changing the others, you end up where those two feather sets abut each other, you end up with what we call a molt limit or a molt contrast. And that's a really, really important principle in aging and molt, because if you can find a molt limit, you know that that bird has undergone a partial molt. If that bird has undergone a complete molt, every feather is the same, and so there's no contrast, there's no molt limit there. And you can see in these central birds here, which are fairly typical for the sort of birds that you will see in your garden and round and about, that molt limit is often in the greater coverts. I pointed that out earlier and said the greater coverts are quite important when it comes to molt. That molt limit is often in the greater coverts, sometimes in the tertials or the tail. And that's something good to keep in mind when you're trying to find a molt limit on a bird. Okay, so just to repeat some of the stuff I just went through, a complete molt, because of its complete nature, that results in a uniform plumage. Every feather is of the same generation, we say. It's uniform, there's no contrast. Whereas a partial molt results in two or at least two generations of feathers, and they contrast with each other. If we start at the very start of the bird's life, the first plumage that a bird grows is juvenile plumage, and juvenile plumage it's sort of special. The reason it's sort of special is that when a bird is in the nest, it is exposed to the elements to a point. It is reliant on its parents feeding it or brooding it. It is vulnerable to predation, and it wants to leave the nest as quickly as it can. That bird is also naked to begin with. So rather than I explain that, birds sort of grow their feathers in this sort of ordered sequence, the young bird doesn't have any feathers at all, so it will grow them all at once to get out of the nest as quickly as it can. And juvenile plumage is usually patterned differently to any subsequent plumage. And you think about that in a lot of birds. The herringull that we looked at, for example, juvenile herringulls are sort of speckly and brown. Juvenile robin, it doesn't have that red breast of the adult. Juvenile blackbird, like we've got in the background here. Many juvenile plumages are strikingly different from adult plumages. So because the feathers are grown very, very quickly, it's sort of like anything in economics. You either pay a lot for something, or you get it done badly, or you just get it done quickly. You choose two. You can't have all three. So in this case, the compromise is that the feathers they're grown quickly with a normal sort of food load from the adults, but they're poor quality. So juvenile feathers are generally of lesser quality than subsequent adult feathers. They are because they've all been grown at the same time in the nest. They are completely uniform. They're all of the same generation. They all have the same amount of wear to them. And being able to identify juvenile feathers, be it by this poor quality or by this uniform nature or by the shape or the pattern, is very useful for aging young birds. As I put here, though, it's not always useful for aging adult birds if you can't find a juvenile feather, but finding juvenile feathers is very useful for aging young birds. Generally, at least part of this juvenile plumage is lost within a few weeks of leaving the nest. And that kind of makes sense. At that point, the bird is independent, it can feed itself, it can move around, it can avoid predators, and so it will try and replace as many of those poor quality juvenile feathers as it can. So to run through the sort of brief life history of this blackbird here. So here it is in this sort of speckly brown juvenile plumage. It's still got some tufts of down on the top of its head there. You can see the tail feathers are not fully grown, but already they're sort of a little bit ragged and a little bit worn at the tip. It's been grubbing around the nest, relatively poor quality. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to stick with the convention. I'm going to color all of this juvenile plumage in red here. What this bird will do, it will undertake a partial molt. We call it a post-juvenile molt because it's taking it into the plumage after juvenile plumage. We'll undertake a partial molt, and that will look something like this. So that's very similar to that sort of typical partial molt that we showed before. It's going to molt the body feathers, the head feathers, and it's going to molt the inner greater coverts. It's going to leave in juvenile feathers the outer greater coverts, the tertials, the primaries, the secondaries, the tail. And that ends up looking kind of like Blue Peter, isn't it? Here's one I made earlier. That ends up looking quite a lot like this. And if I take away the colors, you can see, as we were talking about before, if a bird has a partial molt, it results in a molt limit or a molt contrast. And in the middle of the greater coverts there, you can see the black adult type greater coverts that this bird has molted as part of its partial molt. And then there's brown juvenile greater coverts that the bird has retained from its juvenile plumage. So with that, we can age this bird as a young bird. This bird, there we go, there's the molt limit. This bird will then undergo, after a year of life, a complete molt. Once it's had that complete molt, it will end up looking just like this. You see, this bird doesn't have any contrast. All of the feathers are the same generation. They're all that glossy black coloration. So with no molt limit, we can age this bird as an adult, right? So far, so straightforward, right? And this is something that you can very easily look for on the blackbirds in your garden. This bird, year on year, will have a complete molt, complete molt, complete molt, and that will keep going for the rest of this bird's life. It won't change its plumage once it's reached this adult plumage. The same is true on females. It's easier to look on male blackbirds because you have that contrast between the black adult type feathers and the brown juvenile feathers. The issue with looking on females is that you're looking for a contrast between brown and brown. You can see it. You can see it on this bird quite clearly in this case, but they're a little tougher. And I suggest if you want to practice on a bird, find a male blackbird to practice with. So there we go. There's the molt limit on this bird. And if we put that in graphical form, this is effectively what we end up with. We've got that red juvenile plumage. It has that partial molt, which results in a molt limit in the greater coverts. And then it has a complete molt, which runs indefinitely for the rest of the bird's life, where we have that uniform adult type plumage. Okay, so nice and easy. Molt limit equals young. Uniform equals adult. Here's a pied flycatcher. Very, very obvious in the greater coverts there. We've got black and white inner greater coverts, and then we've got plain brown outer greater coverts. So is it a young bird? No, not necessarily. And this is where, David, your head is going to start spinning for a little bit. At this point, we have to start looking at molt strategies. And there we go. This has got 2 stars because it's a critical thing to take away from this talk. So to be able to understand the molt that we're seeing on a particular species, we have to know how it molts. So if we go back to this triangle again, we've got migration surviving the winter, we've got breeding, and we've got molting that's fitted in around that. There are a couple of possible scenarios for when a bird could molt. It could molt after it's bred, before it migrates in autumn, or before it has to face the winter. Or for migrant birds, it could wait until after it's migrated, and then it could molt on the wintering grounds. Birds could also molt before they breed in spring, but often birds want to breed as quickly as they can. So that sort of time is a little bit constrained. They don't waste their time so much molting there. It tends to happen more after breeding, but they have those 2 strategies. We can start to define that as summer molt that takes place on the breeding grounds effectively, or winter molt that takes place on the wintering grounds. We've already seen that there are effectively 2 types of molt. There's complete molt and there's partial molt. And we know that there are 2 age classes of bird. There are, for the sake of simplicity here, we're calling young birds and adult birds, older birds. So we end up with this sort of matrix here, where we can start to put together any combination of these 3 categories to create a molt strategy. So some birds will have a complete molt in summer as a young bird. Some birds will have a partial molt in winter as an adult bird, a complete molt in winter as an adult bird, so on. You can combine all of those together. Knowing that different combination, knowing which age class has what type of molt at what time of year, is what is going to allow us to understand molt and ultimately to age the birds that we're looking at. So if we go back to the blackbird, just a refresher of that as we were looking at before. So from juvenile plumage, it undergoes this post-juvenile molt in the summer, and then they have a complete post-breeding or a complete summer molt for the rest of their lives. That molt strategy is true of many of the garden birds that we see, many of the common birds. So this one, unlike the pied flycatcher, this is not a trick question. This is a brambling. Brambling has a partial post-juvenile molt and a complete post-breeding molt. So the young birds are the only age class that have a partial molt. Adults are the only age class that have a complete molt. So if we look at this bird, we can see a clear molt limit here, maybe not quite as clear as the blackbird, but between that glossy black orange tipped greater coverts and the brown white tipped greater coverts just there. So we know this bird has had a partial molt, and because young birds are the only age class that has a partial molt in this species, we can confidently age this bird as a young bird. Similarly, if we look at this bird, I can flick backwards and forwards just so you can see the differences there. But if you look across the greater coverts of this bird, they're all glossy black. That orange on the tips extends all the way out to the edge of the wing. So this uniform plumage implies that this bird has had a complete molt, which means this bird is an adult. So if we know the molt strategy and it's this partial post-juvenile, complete post-breeding, birds are often relatively straightforward to age. So there it is again graphically. That applies, as I said, to many common garden birds, robins, blue tits, great tits, blackbirds, as we've looked at, and also to quite a few rarities. That red-flanked bluetail, this David is the second red-flanked bluetail. Red-flanked bluetail, as we've looked at earlier, has this same molt strategy. Great grey shrike has this molt strategy. Okay, then we can look at the pied flycatcher. So I told you that molt limit didn't necessarily mean that bird was a young bird. Pied flycatchers, kind of like the birds we've just looked at, they have this partial post-juvenile molt. But what they then do, they migrate to Africa in the winter. And when they're on the African wintering grounds, they have an additional partial molt. The adults have a complete molt, similar to blackbirds and bramblings and the species we've just looked at, but they also, on the wintering grounds, have this partial molt. And so you can see, I've put this in yellow here. You can see that by the time they come back in spring, both young birds and adult birds have this molt limit caused by that partial molt on the wintering grounds. And then aging these birds becomes about identifying, are these feathers juvenile or adult that are the outer greater coverts and the primaries? And often that's very difficult. There are some pied flycatchers where I have in my hand at Falsterbo, I struggle to identify them. And so that comes back to this sort of thing I was saying at the start, that sometimes birds are best left unaged. Sometimes if you see a pied flycatcher, it's best just to leave it unaged than trying to work that out. This is the brown winter plumage, and there's the breeding plumage with that molt limit there. Something more straightforward is birds that have complete post-juvenile and complete post-breeding. This is very, very easy because if a bird is not in juvenile plumage, you can't age it. It's as simple as that. The slide's in the wrong order. White wagtail goes with pied flycatcher. So starling is one of those species that has a complete post-juvenile and a complete post-breeding. So this is a juvenile bird. This is the same juvenile bird that's on the title slide, molting its wing feathers. It's also molting some body feathers here. There we go, undergoing a complete post-juvenile molt. And by the end of its molting period, both the juvenile and the adult birds are going to look like this. So as I say, really, really straightforward. You simply can't age them, no matter what view you get. Within reason, there are some tricks with common starling, but for the sake of this, you can't age these birds. There's then another molt strategy which is sort of similar. Here's some other birds: long-tailed tit, house sparrow, bearded tit, and so on. Also have this complete post-juvenile and complete post-breeding. So you can't age these birds as well once they've finished their molt. There's a similar molt strategy, but it's undertaken by migrant birds. And so it's effectively this sort of complete post-juvenile, complete post-breeding, except in this case, instead of it taking place on the breeding grounds, there's a migration inserted in between. So the juvenile bird migrates south, normally to sub-Saharan Africa. It undergoes that complete molt. It migrates north again, then it migrates south again and undergoes the complete molt again into adult plumage and so on and so forth. The commonest example of a species that undertakes that sort of molt are the acrocephalous warblers, the reed warblers, and so on. So here's a juvenile bird. This bird is straight out of the nest. So it hasn't really been exposed to sunlight yet. It's not really been exposed to the elements. And its feathers are still relatively fresh, relatively neat. They're not great quality, but they're not yet sort of worn and beaten by the elements. And you can see that with the primaries there, they still have these thin fringes to them. The tertials, they still have a nice, neat edge to them. The same with the greater coverts there. That bird will go to Africa. It will undergo a complete molt, and it will then return in the spring. So this is a bird that was caught in April here in Sweden. You can see it's relatively fresh. It still sort of has those pale tips to the primaries. It still has the edges to the tertials, but it's a little bit worn. At this point, the plumage is a couple of months old, and it's undergone one migration from Africa north, in this case to Sweden. Those of you who've got kids will know that kids take their toll. And after the breeding season, this is what this bird ends up looking like. You can see it's lost all of those fringes to the primaries. They've all worn away. This bird has lost a couple of tail feathers here. There's bits missing from the tertials and so on, and it's become really pretty worn. And that's a consequence of not just the sun and the general abrasion, but living in a reed bed, moving around, having to find food, feeding the young, and so on. Really takes its toll on the plumage. So this bird that we saw in spring, just a few months later, by about August, it's going to look like this. And this bird will then migrate to Africa in this worn plumage. When it gets to Africa, it will molt again and then come back looking like this. So it's similar, as I said, to that very simple molt strategy before, where birds, they just have a complete molt. The first molt they have is a complete molt, except it's sort of a little further away. We don't actually see that molt taking place in Europe. We just see the consequences of it when birds come back. To try and represent how that is with how the plumage wears a little bit, again, we take red as juvenile plumage, and you can see it sort of starts to fade over the autumn until that bird goes to Africa. Where that blue arrow is where they molt. They come back in this fresh, or in this case, the bright blue plumage, and that fades over the year again. They renew that, they come back, and so on and so forth. You might ask, if we're trying to age a bird, how do we tell the difference between a juvenile and one of these birds in early spring? The simple answer is really you would never see them together. And that's another factor that is important when you're trying to establish the age or the molt of a bird, is the time of year. Especially when you're looking at species where wear and bleaching and so on comes into play. Working out when, if you've got a photo, when was that photo taken? Or if you're watching a bird, working out how should that bird look at that particular moment. The reality is, in this case, is that the two age classes that we'd be comparing would be the juvenile on the right here and the worn adult on the left. And then they become actually pretty easy to age. We would never see a fresh adult alongside a fresh juvenile. The good thing about this is that we can apply this to pretty much any species if we know the molt strategy. So David, am I allowed to open it up to the audience for them to shout out what they think this is, or I can put the pressure on you?
Well, yeah, I'll go first. When I looked at it, I thought it was a sedge warbler, but audience, anyone want to make a suggestion? So
I can't actually see the chat. I can see somebody has posted in the chat, but I can't see it.
Well, Jonathan said Paddyfield warbler.
Yeah, it's a good guess. It's a reasonable guess. We don't know what this is. That's the answer. We don't know. It's a hybrid. We assume that one of the parents is sedge warbler, and we don't know what the other parent is. Very, very small, actually. So one of the parents could be Paddyfield warbler, and I think I've got a slide in this later on, which is intriguing in that context. Or Blythe's reed warbler was the other possibility, but the answer is we don't know. It's some kind of hybrid between a sedge warbler and something else. So sorry, that was a horrible question to put out there. But the great thing is we know any of the parent species all have this same molt strategy. They all have this complete winter molt, and they have the same aging criteria where if we see a bird, as this was in, I think, September, we caught this bird, fresh plumage equals young and worn plumage equals adult. So the point of kind of putting this slide in is that we don't know what this bird is, but we can still age it by sort of using those principles that we would use with any of the possible parent species. And that leads us on to talking about the relationship between molt strategies between species. And often within a family, the molt strategy and the molt that we see is similar. So here's the blackbird that we've looked at already, and then here's a missel thrush. And you can see it's more subtle, but there's a molt limit there in the greater coverts. Missel thrushes and blackbirds have the same malt strategy. However, as always, as I've said, there's a sort of general rules, and there are lots of exceptions. Redback Shrike and Great Grey Shrike, for example, have quite different malt strategies. If you look within the leaf warblers, the Philoscopus warblers, between Chiffchaff Willow Warbler and Wood Warbler, they all have really quite differing malt strategies. Willow Warbler is the only European passerine that has 2 complete malts every year as well. So although we can extrapolate a little bit within a family, to correctly interpret malt and therefore to be able to age a bird, we must know the species malt strategy. And there we go. This has got 3 stars. If you take one thing and one thing only away from this talk, remember, to correctly age a bird, you have to know the malt strategy. And then you can start from there. You can build things up from there. It's no good guessing. It's no good sort of looking and saying, well, it's got pale tips, so maybe it's a young bird, or it's got a malt limit, so maybe it's a young bird. Check the malt strategy. There are plenty of books around that tell you about this. Many admittedly aimed at ringers. So Svensson's Ringing Guide is probably the best for this. But if you're interested in taking this sort of beyond just the common garden birds, then I suggest getting a copy of that and learning the malt strategies, or maybe not even learning them, but checking them at least. And then there's the rest. Herring gulls gulls in general have a relatively straightforward malt sequence, malt strategy, but we know that they take 4 or 5 years to develop from that brown juvenile plumage up to the grey and white adult plumage. There we go. Here's, as I said, feral pigeon, one of my favourite birds to look at when I'm sat at a bus stop with nothing else to do. You can see in this bird's secondaries, there's a malt limit there. There's some old brown feathers. There's a new darker black feather there. There's some other feathers that are kind of intermediate. This bird probably has at least 2, maybe 3 generations of feathers there. As I said, really, really complicated molt, much more complicated than sort of people assume for a bird that's common and overlooked. It's malting its primaries as well. You can see new primaries coming through. As I said earlier, really good practice. If you want to be able to spot molt on a blackbird in the garden or a robin in the garden or something like that, start with feral pigeons. You can get your eye in for seeing that difference between the different feather generations, the molt strategies of them, and then you can apply that to birds where it's maybe a little more supple, or they're not quite so cooperative in coming close for you to take a look. Raptors by their size and also their necessity to keep airborne and keep the aerodynamics, they molt over a long period of time. Sometimes it will take 4 or 5 years before a complete set of feathers has been completely changed over in raptors. So these are really sort of next level complicated stuff for anybody who wants to get into molt and aging. Ducks as well. You can see these quite commonly at the park. You'll notice sort of late summertime, all of the male mallards, they all go into this what we call eclipse plumage, this very sort of drab female-like plumage. I've sort of been hammering home all the way through that birds have this sequence of molt, and they sort of molt their primaries one by one and they stay airborne and so on. Ducks don't do that. Wildfowl don't do that. They drop all of their primaries all at once. So what they do is they go into this sort of camouflaged plumage. They become very unobtrusive while they change all their wing feathers all at once. And it's clearly a strategy that works well, because then they spend less time actually molting, even if they have a few weeks where they are really helpless, really. They can't fly, they can't move anywhere. And then they molt back into this sort of breeding bright plumage that we're used to. Beyond just using molt for aging, we can use molt for identification and for taxonomy and things like that. This is red-breasted flycatcher. This is a young male in spring on the left and an adult male in spring on the right. They will look like that through the next 12 months until they have their next complete molt. Here is tiger flycatcher, never a species that I've seen, so I've stolen some photos from British birds. But on the left here is a tiger flycatcher of the same age as that red-breasted flycatcher above. But you'll notice that strikingly, it looks very adult-like. It's got that red throat and that grey surround to it. Similarly, on the right here, there's a tiger flycatcher in winter. And I've just told you that this adult is going to look like that year round. So what's going on here? Tiger flycatcher has a more extensive partial molt to gain its breeding plumage. And not only does it help with the identification, because a young red-breasted flycatcher would never show such a red throat, but it's also one of several reasons, along with call and genetics and plumage and so on, that suggested that species should be split from red-breasted flycatcher. So molt often links into life history, and life history often links into things that push speciation, and it's often a factor to consider in taxonomy. So it goes beyond just simply aging birds. Okay, summary of that. While your head is still spinning, molt, it's controlled, and it's important and necessary for every bird. Molts can be complete or they can be partial, and different species follow different molt strategies. These strategies determine how a bird molts, and therefore what we see. If it's a partial molt, we see a molt limit. If it's a complete molt, we see it uniform. And by knowing a species molt strategy, including the extent of the partial molts and where to look for molt limits and so on, and the time of year, and good enough views, it should be possible to age just about any species that we come across. So I shall stop sharing now.
Well,
Steve, give you a minute to.
My head, I'm sure everyone else's heads are still spinning, and I will be spinning for some time to come. You are, I think, a great teacher, and I think that you should one day be doing this kind of thing as a sort of a course, because I know there's ringing courses and stuff, but this is, I think, for me, explained quite clearly, but just need to have time to kind of sink it in. Now, listen, we have kind of overrun an hour, because normally we talk for an hour. We can talk for 2 hours, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But what we'll do is we'll do the Q&A now in a minute, because I think there's a few questions that have come to rise since the presentation. I need to ask you a couple of questions first. And by the way, before I ask those questions, if you're watching this in the future on YouTube and you're wondering, how do I get to see the Q&A? Become a member of the Urban Birder World community, and you can have all the Q&As for every single past conversation that we've had, which has been around about 150 or so now. So yeah, and I'm actually running out of battery apparently, my phone, so I better get my battery organized. Now, the thing I also wanted to ask you is, have you a favorite bird at all?
This is the sort of impossible question, isn't it? Always. But I do, and it's a species that has increasingly become my favorite, and that's the common redstart. And I think it goes back to heading off. I said I used to head off into North Wales and so on, and do some birding there, going into the oak woodlands in Wales and seeing common redstart there. They were always quite a special bird. And then I remember, for example, my first time down at Portland on Dorset on the south coast and seeing a male redstart. I remember arriving, I was being 15 or something like that, arriving at the Obs Quarry and seeing a male redstart just flitting around in the quarry. And, that is sort of migration in action. That bird had just come in across the channel. It just made landfall. And that sticks in my mind, that vision of this beautiful bird, black face, red body, grey upper parts. I've really grown fond of them even more so since I moved to Sweden, because they actually breed. We have a courtyard, there's a window just here, a courtyard with a single sycamore tree, a couple of laurels. Really not great habitat at all. We have a pair of common redstarts breeding in the courtyard, and for me, when they return here at the end of April, hearing that song for the first time is magical. I don't think I will ever get tired of hearing that song for the first time, and then seeing the male sitting up on an aerial or up on top of the sycamore tree, just singing all summer long. I think they're fantastic. They're beautiful, but they've also got that sort of specialness appeal for me.
Yeah, I remember seeing my first ever common redstart in my back garden in Wembley, North London, and I was, wasn't that long. Well, it was back in the 80s, so it's some time ago. But it's later on in my juvenile period, should I say? And if you could be anywhere on this planet, where would you be?
I'm lucky enough to have been to a lot of places, but Falsterbo on a day in autumn, I think is the place I would be. It's a shame we haven't had time to talk about it actually, but Falsterbo is fantastic. Imagine a sky full of 500,000 chaffinches. You can't beat that. You can go anywhere in the world, and Falsterbo is half an hour down the road from me here. When the wind's in the right direction at the right time of year, the birding is just superb.
Yeah, well, I actually I've experienced some of that stuff, and it is amazing. A place you need to go to, and I think we may have to have you back to talk about that. So
absolutely,
we
can do over an hour of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So Zoomers and anyone else for that matter, we have some more interesting folk appearing on in conservation with in the coming weeks, including my good friend Stephen Moss, who's actually here next week, and he's talking about his new book, which is all about owls. And we're also talking to Marilyn Simons, who wrote a book about Louise de Kerelin Lawrence, who was an extraordinary recluse who changed the way we see birds. And there's a whole load more people coming, including, I'm looking forward to this, in early December, Darren Naish, who is into cryptozoology, and I'm really fascinated by that subject. So that's all to come. Stephen, thank you very much for that really fascinating insight. It's the sort of thing that you need to watch again, I think, to actually start really getting to grips with it. I've actually started thinking about looking at all my pictures again of all the thousands of birds I've taken to see if I can work out the ages. So
I will say just briefly that we do a ringing course at Falsterbo over 4 days, and we pack all of this into 4 days, and even that feels a little bit extreme. So to get it all into 1 hour is just the tip of the iceberg.
Wow. Well, maybe it's a trip to Falsterbo for some of us then. So thank you very much, Stephen, for being here. Really appreciate that.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you, Zoomers. And we're going to go straight into Q&A. But until then, or before then even, don't forget, keep looking up.